Bonjour, monsieur. Bonjour, mademoiselle. Parlez-vous français? Well, can you guess what country we're studying today? Possibly France? And the French king? Royal king? Probably one of the most celebrated kings, or I should say, the king that reigned the longest in France. And his name was Louis the 14th. Louis the 14th, I would say, had a little bit of, psychologically speaking, delusions of grandeur. What does that mean? He thought he was pretty grand and pretty special. In fact, he said he was more important than the sun is to the earth, or more important than the sun is to France. So he thought big of himself. He was very proud, and he believed that he was really anointed, if not God himself, for the French people. So Louis the 14th set the standard for royal power in Europe in the 1600s, which meant he believed that the royal family should have more power than anyone else. He was not into any nobles, or as they said, come in, or parliament at all. He also increased the international trade in France, which made France more wealthy, although he took most of the wealth, as he would put on taxes and tariffs so that the royal palace would be covered. He also was involved in numerous European wars, which depleted France's wealth, but also increased his control of lands and control of areas through not only him, but also his family, the royal family. He had his sons and his grandsons, you'll find out, were actually marrying princesses in the other lands to control them. His idea was basically he would like France to control all of Europe, maybe even the whole world. He increased the settlement, the colonies in America. In fact, he claimed the whole part when we have Cartier going over there. Remember the French explorer? And later on we'll talk about a couple other explorers. But he went and he claimed that whole area for France. And it was called Louisiana, after Louis. And they called it the Louisiana Purchase later on. We'll find out what happened. But that doesn't happen for another 100 years. So he wanted to make France, and France did become one of the most powerful nations in Europe. Let's go back a little bit before this. What happened in the 1500s? In the 1600s, before Louis was born? Well, France was a part of the Reformation. And a lot of people in France came to know the Lord, came to follow, not only follow Martin Luther, but they followed the Protestant John Calvin, and they were called the Huguenots. Well, the French king at that time, his name was Henry IV. He issued an edict called the Edict of Nantes that gave the Protestants right to worship freely in certain areas. Not Paris, but any other area they could live, and they could worship and have churches. And he also gave the French nobles that desired that they could share in the authority with the government and help him rule. And they formed what was called the Estates General. And this was a representative of each different state would come in and give recommendations to the king to help the king rule. And it worked well for a while. But when he died, the next king was Louis the 13th, and he was only 8 years old, and he became king in 1610. And basically, he was so young that they had to have someone rule for him. So the Cardinal, Richelieu, he was the one that actually ruled France under Louis the 13th, the 8-year-old king. And he really didn't like the Huguenots much, of course, because they weren't Catholic and he was a Catholic priest. And then as Louis called together the Estates General, he didn't like, and the cardinal didn't like what they were saying, and Louis didn't like what they were saying, so they dismissed the Estates General and said that they would handle everything. Not a really good idea, because people were very much upset the way the king wanted all this power and the way the church wanted all this power. And so the under Cardinal Richelieu increased the power of the French king. He gave the French king more power, which gave him more power, and limited the rights to the Huguenots and nobles. They had less rights. But he also increased the international trade and gave more wealth to the king. He was really into the royal family. But then Richelieu died in 1642, and Cardinal Mazarin became the next priest to rule. Well, it looked like it was already getting kind of complicated, and then Louis died when he was only in his early 40s. He died in 1643, and so Louis XIV was only 4 years old and became king. Of course, the Cardinal Mazarin would have to rule, and underneath he and the Queen Mother ruled too. Mazarin died in 1661, but Louis XIV grew up with thinking he was everything. He was this prince at 4 years old and king at 4 years old, you can imagine. And so he decided, and surprised everything, that he did not want a prime minister to rule for him and that he would make all the decisions. And he put the symbol of himself as that Sun King. And he never doubted himself. He just thought, the state is me and I am the state. And my authority comes from God. Nobody better question my decisions. And he increased the army so the army would protect him, so that there would be no rebellions. And rebellions were starting to go on in that time. He did appoint Jean-Baptiste Colbert as a financial minister to collect taxes, though, because taxes were very important. And he developed this new kind of taxation that was called mercantilism. And what they would do is they would give and support, merchants and give them money, but they would have to give back all the money and they tax them more. So it was like they were borrowing money from the government, but the government ended up claiming a lot of it back. So it wasn't really, people were not really happy with that at all. He increased the foreign trade, but again, on everything he traded, he put taxes. They call them tariff taxes on everything. And the buyers paid the price of the taxes and the tariffs. And so the France in itself, especially the royalty, became more wealthy, wealthier and wealthier. So then the exploration in America, and I better go over this kind of quickly because I think that you've gone over the brave explorers before, and we talked about Cartier, but now it's booming in Canada and in the United States. The fur trade is magnificent, and they're bringing home minerals and fishing and all kinds of things from the new land. And so France, now Louis was still looking for that northwest passage that would go over the Arctic, over to get to China again. They still were looking for some kind of passage. So he decided to send and finance more explorers to go over there, of course. He also he said it was okay, he wanted to bring some priests over there too, so that they could spread Catholicism. And some of them were just into just telling them about Jesus, spreading the gospel. In 1668, he founded Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan as a French city. And then he sent two explorers, Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet. So they called him Marquette and Joliet. One was a priest. Jacques Marquette was a priest. And so they worked together and they explored the Mississippi River. And they went all the way down to Memphis, Tennessee. So they were exploring the whole inner part of the United States, clear down to Mississippi. They formed a mission in 1675 called Marquette, actually formed it, and it was called Kaskaskia. So Kaskaskia, Illinois. In 1682, Robert de La Salle also went in to explore, and he reached the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi River, and he called this whole area Louisiane after King Louis the 14th. In 1718, he founded the city of New Orleans. So we have France controlling most of Central America. So I'm going to take a little break so we go on a little more.